Welcome to Cultivate, a Veritas Academy podcast, where we explore truth, beauty, and goodness through meaningful conversation. We invite you to join us in discussions meant to edify your mind, encourage your heart, and equip your family to live abundantly in Christ.
Welcome back to Cultivate. I'm Ty Fischer. I'm the head of school here at Veritas Academy and the host of this podcast. I'm here today with two of my favorite people, Graham Dennis and Bruce Etter, our Dean of Students and our Dean of Humane Letters, respectively. And we're going to talk about dead people, right? So
that's correct, Ty.
I'm planning on giving an homage, so I'm just going to start with it. We read dead people.
Don't tell the end of the story.
Yeah, I know. That's from a movie that was really exciting about 20 years ago. So kids, if you don't know what that is, ask your parents. But we're going to talk about Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and what teenagers today can learn from the ancients, from people that have been dead for thousands of years. So Bruce and Graham teach humanities here. Bruce is the Dean of Humane Letters. So let's just start with what was in your educational background that caused you to fall in love with the literature of the ancients?
Well, my formal education is all in Bible and theology. My degrees are all in Bible and theology. But the year was, I think it was 2005, Ty.
2005?
You came to me in January of 2005, and you said, Bruce, I have an opening in Omnibus 1. Can you get out on the field? And I said, put me in, coach. I had not read, I don't think I had read any of the books at that point. So I started in January, and the more I read, the more I fell in love with ancient literature. And honestly, the more angry I got, because none of my teachers ever introduced me to any of those authors. I fell in love with Plato. I fell in love with Livy. I fell in love with Virgil and Herodotus.
Wow. And Bruce, you mentioned Omnibus 1. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. That's kind of our core humanities curriculum here at Veritas. Graham, what was it like for you? How did you fall in love with the ancients?
Oh, similarly to Bruce, I started my academic career in college in theology. Basically wanted to study scripture and theology at Columbia International University. And I had a professor there. I started taking his philosophy classes, Mac, if you remember.
Mac.
Yep.
Dr. Mac.
And I took as many as I could. And then he said, you can't take any more classes here. So he sent me over to the University of South Carolina. And at the University of South Carolina, I met Rosamund Kent Sprague, who at the time was one of the world's leading Plato scholars. But she was such a unique woman. She was a Christian, a devout believer, and not only taught Plato and Aristotle and a lot of ancient literature, but she also taught an independent study on Dorothy Sayers and C.S. Lewis at her house. We'd have tea at her house, high tea. Her husband had been English. And
this doesn't sound like many college classes.
No, exactly. The University of South Carolina. So
this was during football games or not?
Yeah, no. So Dr. Sprague really caused me to fall in love with ancient literature. And there was another professor, Victoria Voitko, who also was an ancient scholar. And the two of them just loved ancient literature. So it was really them. And like Bruce, I also fell in love with reading these texts. And it was a hole in my education. It was missing. And then grad school, I went on to study philosophy at Boston College and had Peter Kreeft, which of course deepened my love for Plato.
Yeah, that would do it. But we live in a generation where the things made 5 minutes ago are old, and the things made 5 hours ago on TikTok are obsolete. So why spend all of this time reading dead people?
You know, Ty, I recently saw an article, I think it was just last week, about a teacher who decided that he was not going to teach any books that were written by any authors who were dead at all. Every single one of them had to be people who were living. And I thought to myself, that has to be the pinnacle of hubris.
Yeah.
That has to be the height. Okay, so what are we looking at? We start with Gilgamesh and we do Hammurabi, but then we really camp out with the Greeks. So let's just say 3,000 years, give or take.
Yeah.
Maybe 4,000 years. So what brilliant people have been saying for 4,000 years is not important. It's outdated. It's obsolete. So we're not going to read it. I think it's just a height of arrogance to say that. I think we have a lot to learn from these individuals who are dead.
Yeah. Graham, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, technically, I'm not going to add to this. I'm going to just read a quote from G.K. Chesterton. I think it's one of the if you have a pencil or a pen handy, get ready. So I think this is a wonderful explanation of why we read dead people, as Ty put it. Here it is. Tradition means giving a vote to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. All Democrats object to men being disqualified by the accident of birth. Tradition objects to their being disqualified by the accident of death. Democracy tells us not to neglect a good man's opinion, even if he is our groom. Tradition asks us not to neglect a good man's opinion, even if he is our father. Chesterton is so,
Yeah.
But I would just say, just sort of a brief commentary on that. We can't see very well. We tend to be myopic. Every generation is going to only see so far. What it means to read the dead or to read ancient literature is to see beyond our own time and to have a perspective, to be able to see from above. It's like, zooming out on Google and, wow, look at Lancaster County. There's so many small subsistence farms. Isn't it unique? To be able to see your own time from the perspective of a time that's not your own is really valuable.
Yeah, that's so good. But what if someone would say, like, come on, like, how can that be interesting to students? Why not just take the issues and talk about them, talk about love and talk about war and talk about jealousy and just pull the topics, but, pull them from things that we could take out of the newspaper, although, come on, I mean, like the newspaper. So I think TikTok is probably a little bit more up to date than the newspaper, but we'll just pull everything from something that is part of their experience. What is so blessed about, well, why not just do that?
Yeah, I got to jump on this one, Ty. Yeah, I've been working with teenagers for about 30 years, and I've noticed that they like the fads, they like the trends. What is the new shiny thing that's coming down the path? And they're enamored by it, and sometimes they end up following after worldviews that are not godly and not biblical. One of the things I think that I see teenagers get a little bit excited when they, first of all, that it's actually not a new shiny thing. Mm-hmm. It's been around for a long time. It's just being repackaged in some kind of modern, fancy, electronic way. But I think it also helps protect them. We always get nervous, when we hand them that diploma and we know they're gone. They're not under our little safe roof anymore. And to go out there to that scary world where they're going to encounter all these different worldviews. But what we're doing when we read all these dead people is our students are able to look at this new shiny thing and say, oh, that's just Plato repackaged.
Yes.
Or that's just fill in the blank. Repackaged. I recognize that. That's not new.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to issues that have to do with how we view the body and the soul, the distinction between the body and the soul. It all really goes, at least to Plato. I mean, Plato, one of his mentors was Pythagoras. So maybe it goes back even further. But in other words, there's nothing new under the sun. And I think it's a bit of a protection for our students when they go out. They just don't fall for stuff.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And of course, it is, for me, it's been a little bit telling as I've been involved in classical education now for about a little over 25 years. So many times when I'm watching TV or a movie, I realize they've just stolen this from, Megamind is just a retelling of Paradise Lost. I think that there were some parts of this last season of Stranger Things that were really just Paradise Lost. And I'm like, you'd think that people would come up with different ideas, but some of these things are so deeply built into us that they just keep coming out again and again and again. So, but we're educators, and this last 150 years of education has really been about, like, it seems like there's a constant search for novelty, outcomes-based education, no child left behind, Common Core. So is education, should we expect it to be about change, or what is the world missing if education changes every 15 years?
I'm gonna piggyback on something Bruce just said. What was implicit in what Bruce said is something that postmodern educators have lied to us about. They've basically said we can't understand people from other cultures, that cultures are kind of like these unique, isolated little boxes, and people's experience is kind of bound within a culture, and we can try to step into their shoes, but we can't really. Think about this. I can read a translation of a book that may have been written in 800 BC, and I can understand that text. And the reason I can understand it is because the author is talking about things that are universal to human experience. Yeah. And it's quite a mystery. God decided to communicate to us in particular languages. He decided to communicate to us in Hebrew and Greek. Koine Greek is a dead language. Nobody speaks Koine Greek. And yet, we can still read the New Testament, and we trust the translation. So I think one of the challenges is if we think that the only things that are valuable are the things that are the latest, or the only things that are valuable are the things that are the newest. I mean, here's a natural conclusion our students are going to draw. The Bible, by definition, isn't valuable. Right. The entire Western canon, the majority of it, isn't valuable.
And pretty soon their parents aren't valuable.
Right? Right. And pretty soon, right. That's kind of Chesterton's point, right?
Right. Instead of, Wendell makes that point that modern people outmode their ancestors instead of succeeding their ancestors. Instead of being part of that story, they end up being someone that tries to supersede it. But isn't there a joy in having a foundation under you? Isn't there a joy in kind of the cultural heritage? And the Western cultural heritage, honestly, when you think about cultures around the world, the Western cultural heritage welcomes in anybody who wants to embrace the ideas of the West. So that's just been a joyful thing to me. Any more adding on there about how can we help people see that it's a bad thing if education just changes? If what it means to be educated is able to change every 15 or 20 years, it's just a terrible thing.
Yeah, I think, one of the biggest characteristics of modern man, when I say modern man, I mean us right now, living now, is what our logic teachers call chronological snobbery. And, I wonder if what happens is we kind of look at advances in technology and we think, oh my word, look at my parents. My parents didn't even have the internet. And we kind of conflate that with ideas, worldview, philosophy, theology. So because those folks were backwards and they used phones that had wires that went into a wall,
or that went into a car. That's my favorite, when they pull out that gigantic phone.
The bag.
Yeah.
Big bag. So, therefore, they must be backwards in every other way.
Sure.
So, I think that's just a huge mistake that modern man makes.
Well, digging down deeper into Plato and Aristotle especially, is there some kind of special importance to studying these two in a society that wants to be free and that wants to be governed democratically? How could we see maybe the debates and the disagreements and what these two philosophers were after as meaningful in a democratic society?
Yeah, one thing real quickly about Plato. Aristotle and Plato differ on some things, but what they both seem to agree upon is if you're going to have a society in which the opinion of your citizens matters, they're going to have to be educated.
Yep.
But then the very next question is, what does education look like? And for Aristotle and Plato, people forget this. These were probably the most important on-the-ground practical questions. Plato started a school, which of course became very famous, the Academy, which was the...
We named part of Veritas' name after that.
That's right. Yeah. And Plato knew that if you are going to have free people, they're going to have souls that experience internal freedom, regardless of whether or not the state is free, whether or not the state provides the occasion for freedom. And Aristotle thought the same thing in founding the Lyceum. So education isn't just about pouring information in. It's about creating students who have enough internal freedom and liberty to move from the liberty of their own souls to eventually, let's say, being senators, congressmen, heads of households, headmasters. The reality is that internal freedom is the condition for the possibility of a free society.
Yeah, so you have to have that internal freedom, and you also have to have truth.
That's right.
And it seems to me, as I wander around the world now, that's one of the most scary things about America is that in a very real way, the capital T truth that the world is built on, like that the external world has reality. There's a reality outside of your brain. It seems to be that that's in question at this point, which is really, really fun.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I think there's a bit of a tie-in here with Solzhenitsyn. I just thought of that. That famous, was it 1978? Harvard commencement address. And he comes over here and as a conservative and tells all these liberals, if you're going to go the way of materialism, your culture is going to fall apart. Plato, and I think Graham, you might want to comment on this a little bit more. I've had some amazing conversations with Graham about Plato's Republic, and he's very well versed in it and the tripartite soul and how the soul's connected to the structure of a society. But what I think Solzhenitsyn was hitting at is that there's a spiritual realm and there's a spiritual reality and there's a connection between the arrangement of your soul and the condition of your soul and the way a society is set up and governed. And I think in many ways our world has left that behind. But yeah, I don't know, Graham, if you want to add to what some of the things that I think you said you actually learned from Dr. Kreeft on the Republic.
I think what Solzhenitsyn saw that Plato saw so well is it's amazing that you can have a society in which the rulers, the leaders, the intellectual elites in your society are lying to you, and they're telling you absurd things, and yet enough people believe them that your society eventually ends up in a place of absolute despair. That was Solzhenitsyn's experience living in communist Russia. And what's interesting is that's increasingly our experience. What's the solution? Well, in Plato's Republic, Plato says, well, the solution is, step one, you have to know that people are lying to you. And the condition for the possibility of knowing that people are lying to you is knowing the truth. You couldn't possibly know someone is lying to you unless you can compare what they're saying against what is true. And so Plato called them sophists. And he says the problem with Athens is it's governed by people who are incredibly persuasive at the art of disinformation, basically using rhetoric.
Disinformation. He said, that sounds
like fake news.
I know. Sounds like it's going on today, right?
Right.
Well, isn't that so much of what you find when you're wandering around in the ancients is, when in the Republic they're talking about the cave, right? And people seeing shadows on the wall and not knowing that they're shadows and thinking that that's reality. But the job of the philosopher is to get them outside of the cave. And then when they get out there, their eyes can't focus right. That's just like cable news for me. Like it's like that's a cave that you crawl into, and it's just like an echo chamber right? So there's so much.
Well, and it conditions our students to be cynical because one of two things happens. Either A, they realize that everything around them is noise. And you can shut down. It's a cacophony.
Nothing
There are too
is
many voices.
Nothing is meaningful.
Yep. And one, I mean, it's a defense mechanism. I'm going to shut down because there are too many options. Nothing's meaningful. The quest for truth it's irrelevant in a society in which you can't find it.
Yeah.
And our job is to help them navigate this complex world in which so many voices are telling them this is true, that's true. So it's a hard job in a society like ours. But what's incredibly paradoxical is that Plato is telling us in Athens that probably had 7,000 citizens, he's telling us that this is going on in 4th century BC.
Mm-hmm.
So to your nothing new is under the sun point, it's not like when Plato's writing the Republic, he's talking about a political phenomenon that only existed in 380 BC.
Yeah.
He's talking about a political phenomenon that is probably even more true for our students than it was for, kids living in Athens.
Yeah. So we have a core curriculum here at Veritas called the Omnibus curriculum, and it's a curriculum that leads people through a reading of the great books. And you all three of us were involved in creating that curriculum. What kind of students does this kind of approach produce, and what's special about the kind of students that have been through that hanging out with dead people often?
Well, this is going to sound like an advertisement for Omnibus, so you're welcome, Ty.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. But, we always say we're teaching students how to think, and we are, but that's a pretty generic statement. The way the Omnibus curriculum is laid out, generally speaking, you start with some sort of general question that would be interesting for anybody. What do you think about fill in the blank? And it is no discernible connection to what you're doing in the class, at least to the students at that point. And then we walk them through these 3 stages. We say, okay, we're reading Livy's Early History of Rome. I love the stories in Livy's Early History of Rome. So we're reading Livy. So, okay, what does Livy say about this? So we do the text analysis. Then we say, well, okay, now let's pull that all the way into our modern day culture. What does the culture say about that? And then finally and ultimately, we ask the question, what does the Bible have to say about that? So, and then we do like a Summa wrap up. So, when a student has done that for 6 years and they followed that pattern of here's this big idea, here's this ideal, and then they don't even realize it, but they automatically know how to analyze big ideas by asking, what does this text say? What is my culture, maybe, as Graham said, maybe possibly lying to me about? But ultimately, the primacy there is on God's word.
Yeah. Well, and it's really special to me too to see how they gain a taste for that kind of discussion or that kind of interaction with other people concerning important ideas. Graham, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just want to use a little analogy because I think there's also an affections, training the affections component, or even we might even say tastes. I grew up in a household in which my dad and mom introduced me to classical music by playing. We called them concerts. My sister and I would get wooden spoons, and they would play. Start with classical music that's more accessible, and then eventually, we got Wagner and whatever. But
that's what every kid wants.
Yeah,
just to sit around listening to Wagner, right?
But if you've been trained on mac and cheese, and you think mac and cheese is the best, it's going to be hard to appreciate eggplant parmesan. And so I didn't
see that coming.
Yeah. I think what we're trying to do, to use an affections taste analogy, is give them a wider and broader experience of tastes, and this goes with the democracy of the dead point, than what they're getting in their own culture. So, for instance, Harry Potter is very entertaining, and this is no screed against Harry Potter, but if you ask your average kid, which is better for your soul, Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings? I want them to say Lord of the Rings because I think it's true. Harry Potter may be more entertaining. I think Lord of the Rings is better for your soul. But then the next question is, why is Lord of the Rings deeper, more substantive? And the answer is because Tolkien was deeper and more substantive than J.K. Rowling. And then you could say the same about C.S. Lewis. You know, there's a lot of children's literature that is fun and enjoyable and exciting. But how much children's literature is as good for their souls as Narnia?
Yeah.
So we're trying to train their affections to like things that might, again, using Bruce's metaphor, there might not be as shiny and new, but once their tastes get trained, it's interesting how you find kids saying, yeah, you were right about Tolkien.
Yeah.
Even though Tolkien, you know, there's stretches of, you know, the Tom Bombadil section.
Or
it's long.
Some of the elfin poetry that I used to fall asleep.
How many songs are in the Fellowship, right? But the reality is we're training their tastes and their affections.
And it moves, it vibrates something deep down.
Yes.
Deep down in our humanity. And that's why it's going to have a lastingness that some things that our modern world, almost everything produced in it, won't have.
Yeah, and just a little encouragement to parents to fast forward. In high school, I kind of became, a metalhead with a mullet, and I listened to heavy metal, and that was my poor parents were tortured by this. And guess what?
What did you listen to Led Zeppelin, and then it pulled you in the direction of the Lord of the Rings?
Right, yeah. So wouldn't you know it? Now today, what do I listen to? 80% of my music library is classical music, and probably the other 20% is jazz. But I came around, and that was because my parents formed my affections when I was young.
That's wonderful, Graham. I just see little Graham with a wooden spoon listening to Wagner and acting like a Valkyrie. That's my...
Maybe that's where the heavy metal came from.
Maybe.
You know, I think what a lot of people don't realize is that the rest of us were listening to that classical music. We just didn't know it. Kill the wabbit.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
All of that stuff.
Right.
It was mostly Wagner, wasn't it?
Yes, a lot of it, yes.
Yeah, he's useful. That's maybe the early NFL before AC/DC came out.
Right.
But our culture a lot of times seems to be kind of entranced or enchanted. That's an interesting word to use for STEM things. You know, and you see a lot of schools cutting art and music to focus more on STEM, cutting the humanities to focus on STEM. Here at Veritas, a lot of times, you know, when people initially find out about our school, I think that they think all of the students that graduate from here are going off to study English and literature and those kinds of things, or the classics. That's certainly not true. Why does this kind of an education make for an even better STEM student, or someone who's going to be devoting their calling and career in life to maybe something that would be more on the engineering kind of technical side?
Yeah, I've been putting off telling you this, Ty, so I'm just going to say it publicly in front of everybody. Our math department is working on a petition right now to rename the school Veritas Tech.
Oh, they? That's great.
Yeah, so that's where we're headed. No, we have an amazing, what I love about...
I'm going to get Mrs. Forbes down here to deny that.
Well, I was getting ready to mention Mrs. Forbes because we have an unusual situation in that we have the person who is the head of our math department also teaches Omnibus. And I think that's fantastic. It just helps our students see that the skills, the tools, we call them tools of learning, that we're giving them in all of classical education, but in our humanities courses, serve them very well.
Yeah.
When they go into chemical engineering or mechanical engineering or whatever the case may be. So these are skills of teaching students how to think, how to problem solve, how to see the different angles of an issue. When I'm doing parent interviews and parents are asking me, what is, what is the heart of classical education? When we get to that dialectic tool, I talk about analogies like it's like taking the engine apart and putting it back together again. Learning how to see any issue, whatever the subject may be, biology, art, from every imaginable angle and analyze it.
Yeah.
And so it's funny. Graham and I joke a lot. We're the literature teachers here, but it seems like we are Veritas Tech.
Yeah. Yeah,
in many ways.
I again, going to give you an analogy here, but it's interesting. We had Frank Baversdorf many years ago.
A father here at the school.
Yep. Come in, worked with the bank, and came into my rhetoric class and was speaking to the kids afterwards and said, do you realize the biggest problem we have in our bank is as people move up the ranks and take on leadership positions, the number one skill we're looking for is, can you lead a room of people? Can you speak to a room of people? Can you so think about someone like Winston Churchill, the darkest of the darkest hours of World War II, and Great Britain is tottering on the brink of disaster, civilizational disaster. And you've got someone like Winston Churchill buoying the nation. Also, C.S. Lewis broadcast talks over the radio, which became Mere Christianity, on the radio, buoying the nation. So a broad person, a broadly educated person, especially is going to be able to communicate, for instance, in a large room. Another example is I had a person who was a chemistry professor say, the biggest problem you have as you rise up the ranks in chemistry is that an excellent chemistry student should become an excellent communicator of what, whether it's writing papers, communicating in front of a classroom, that next stage, that's the next stage. But that's not taught in chemistry. Mm-hmm. To learn how to communicate well, whether you're writing a paper or whether you're communicating at a conference, that's a skill that comes from the humanities. So it's one last analogy is a problem in sports recently has been that our students are increasingly taught to only play one sport. Mm-hmm. And I've heard multiple athletes like Mike Trout say, what's the one thing you would encourage young athletes to do? And they all say, play as many sports as possible, because that's going to make you a well-rounded athlete. And the same is true in education. You may have a particular skill set, but having a broad education makes you a more complete employee.
Mm-hmm. Well, and not just a more complete employee. I mean, that's the part of it that connects to, that STEM and work world. Sure. And, we had one time when 43% of our graduating class was going into medicine.
Yeah, right. Yes.
I was like, well, maybe some more humanities there. But it's that, what I love about our students, one of the great traditions of our school is after senior thesis, which is a tense time for our seniors. They've written a long paper. They have to make a public defense of that paper. We have experts there who are peppering them with questions. Sometimes we have teachers and even members of the audience that are peppering them with questions. And afterward, we go out and we have a nice meal. And we sit down together after this big educational accomplishment, and we just start talking about interesting things again. So they've been trained, they've been formed in a way that conversation around big ideas is something that is sweet to them. So as we think about the value of reading these things, it's not just something that comes across like immediately. Sometimes we have to work with students. I mean, teenagers are busy people, but have you had that experience where there's some book or some part of a book or some discussion that just brings a student to life, and you see them, that love of this kind of literature start to well up?
Yeah, I'll share one. Yeah, frequently when I teach the seniors, I add in a unit on critical theory.
Okay.
And, it's funny. Who was it that said I was country when country wasn't cool? Was it Loretta Lynn?
I don't know.
Okay.
You're from West Virginia, Bruce. So.
I know. I'm embarrassed that I don't know that.
That's your bivouac.
Yeah. So I was doing critical theory when critical theory wasn't cool.
Wow.
Way back. And so I've been doing that for quite some time, and give them a little historical context, and not just CRT, but all areas of critical theory, because CRT is just a slice. Anyway, frequently I will get that text, and I got one this past fall, from a student who is at that moment sitting in an English class at a university somewhere, and the teacher is just loading on what is really these aspects of critical theory. And the most recent text I got was, Mr. Etter, thank you for showing us what this is and how it's looked historically, because I'm sitting here in my, English 101 class, and all the students are just eating it up, and I see exactly what it is. I can see through it. Thank you.
I have an example that's a little different, but it's kind of warmed my heart. Our students, our 10th grade students, are reading Thucydides, and Thucydides, I don't know, Bruce, what you would say about this. Probably not the most scintillating, page-turning reading, right? She was so excited. So in rhetoric, we have a project where they have to do a presentation, a classical discourse presentation to make an argument. And she was so excited about this section where the question was, had the Athenians made the right political move in showing clemency to this, one of their allies, one of their small allies, and she was convinced that they shouldn't have shown clemency as they did, and it had these terrible consequences. And so she was so excited to write this paper on political strategy of the Athenians in Thucydides. That is just amazing.
Yeah, that you see students, and sometimes you never can tell.
Right.
It's something that just kind of pops up. Yeah, I can remember times when teachers have been talking to students about the Hebrew midwives, and the class gets into a biblical discussion of what is lying, whether they're lying, why does God bless lying in this case. So it's one of those things that from year to year, it's a great blessing to see those kinds of discussions kind of erupt. So there are some objections that come up to this kind of approach that we have. One of them is, are seventh graders really ready to read Plato? Are seventh graders really ready for Thucydides or Herodotus? We read Thucydides in 10th grade, but are they really ready for the Odyssey? What do you guys think about that?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is we need to get away from the idea that this is the only time they're going to read it.
Yeah.
This might be the first time they're reading it, but they should have been inspired enough to read it again when they're 25 and 35 and 85. Yeah. But I would say this.
I'm reading the Odyssey right now, by the way, and I don't have to be.
Okay, that's great. Great.
Well,
you had a gold star.
Yeah.
Wait, play Wagner.
Just
play
living
Wagner.
example,
Come on.
Bruce.
Yo, and you're at least 35.
Oh,
Yeah, little more, but
yeah.
Well, I just want to add this really quickly. Graham and I had a professor at Columbia International University named Jack Lehman. You remember Jack Lehman?
Oh, yes.
Sure, right?
Yes.
And he taught this course everyone had to take called Western Man. And so what he basically did was he started with Plato and Aristotle, and he showed how, and I think he was leaning pretty heavily on Francis Schaeffer here, but he showed how all of the history of thought is really just one version of Plato or Aristotle.
Right.
You're really just leaning one way or the other. I think when students are able to look back, which is not what the culture tells them, look forward, but look back and see that all of history really in thought is a pendulum swing between Plato and Aristotle. They can really work through those issues and identify what is the biblical, or as the president of our institution used to say, what is the center of biblical tension? And I think that just helps our students have a balanced approach and hopefully a biblical one.
Yeah. So, Bruce and Graham, thank you for being here. Thank you for thank you for making so many of our students, so many friends amongst the ranks of the dead.
My pleasure.
Ty.
You've been listening to Cultivate, the podcast of Veritas Academy, a preschool through 12th grade classical Christian school in Leola, Pennsylvania. If you would like to learn more about Veritas, please visit veritasacademy.com to discover the truth, beauty, and goodness of classical Christian education.